The Larmor Drift, a novel. Chapter 1, The Hum Below Frequency. Everything is a frequency. The difference between a wall and a doorway is just a matter of knowing which one to resonate with. Nikola Tesla, Private Correspondence, 1899. Elliot Marsh had spent 11 years listening to things most people couldn't hear. That was the job, more or less. Acoustics researcher at Alden University, which sounded impressive at dinner parties until he explained what it actually meant, at which point people's eyes did that slow, polite gaze. He studied how sound moved through materials: stone, water, soil, bone. How a wave generated in one place could travel invisibly through a medium and arrive somewhere else fundamentally changed. Stretched, compressed, absorbed, reflected. How the same note played in an empty cathedral and a tiled bathroom were technically the same sound, and experientially two completely different things. The room was never just a room. The room was always part of the instrument. He was good at it. His graduate students actually learned something, and his papers got cited by people who didn't know him personally. He had an ear. That was how his colleagues said it, with a kind of reverence that embarrassed him. Elliot has an ear, meaning he could walk into a space and feel its acoustic character before running a single measurement. Meaning his body was, in some sense, a piece of equipment. He had never fully appreciated how literally that was true until the hum started. It came on a Tuesday in late October, in the basement of the university's Stoller building, where Elliot kept a secondary workspace mostly because it was quiet and nobody came looking for him there. He was eating lunch and reviewing a spectrograph on his laptop, a visual map of sound, time on one axis, frequency on the other, amplitude shown in color. It looked, as spectrograms usually did, like a painting by someone trying to describe weather. He was not thinking about anything in particular when he felt it. Not heard, felt. A low vibration right in the center of his chest, in the place behind the sternum where you feel sub-bass at a loud show. That physical thump below the reach of normal hearing, where sound stops being something you process and starts being something your whole body responds to. Below 20 hertz, sound becomes infrasound. You can't hear it, but you can feel it, and researchers have documented it causing disorientation, unease, even a feeling that something was in the room with you that wasn't. Elliot knew all of this, so he cataloged it calmly, the way he cataloged everything. Low frequency, sub 20 hertz range, source unknown, building resonance maybe. He looked at his spectrogram. There was a frequency reading he hadn't seen before, sitting at the very bottom of the visible range, steady and clean and completely motionless. Not spiking, not fading. Just there, like it had always been there, and the software had only just decided to show him. He leaned closer to the screen. 17.4 hertz. He looked at it for a long time. Then he saved the file and went back upstairs. But he thought about 17.4 hertz for the rest of the day in the vague, unattached way you think about something that hasn't yet figured out what it wants from you. The Stoller building basement was officially a storage annex. Metal shelving held the physical archaeology of a century of university research. Oscilloscopes, reel-to-reel tape machines, signal generators with cracked casings, a crate of vacuum tubes labeled possibly useful in marker that had faded to near illegibility. Elliot had been given access 2 years earlier when he needed overflow space for a measurement rig, and he'd kept coming back long after the rig was gone, because the room had a quality that he found difficult to name. a stillness that wasn't quite silence. He stopped apologizing for noticing it. The building sat on a foundation of Ordovician limestone. He'd learned that from an old facilities report in a filing cabinet down there. 450 million years old. Dense, pale shelves threaded through with calcite crystal, packed under everything like a secret structural memory. What the report didn't mention was that calcite veins sometimes do something unusual under long-term compression. Press certain crystals hard enough, long enough, calcite, quartz, even bone, and they generate a small continuous electric charge. It's called piezoelectricity, from the Greek word for pressure. It's real, and it's measurable, and it's in your cigarette lighter, and the pickup of an electric guitar, and the trigger of certain airbags. The calcite under Stoller had been under compressive stress from the weight of the building, and a slow memory of tectonic movement for longer than human language had existed. It had been generating its field, quietly and without audience, this whole time. The field had a frequency, 17.4 hertz, the same number sitting at the bottom of his spectrogram like a signature. On his fourth Tuesday back, Elliot found the machine. It was on a bottom shelf behind a box of patch cables, half covered with a canvas equipment bag. He almost left it alone, but there was a label on the side in faded marker, Proton Mag, Field Use, 1987, and Elliot was constitutionally unable to leave old equipment uninspected. It was a proton precession magnometer, and the way it worked was almost musical when you thought about it. Inside the casing was a cylinder of kerosene, hydrogen-rich, and when you ran a current through it, all the protons inside would line up together like a chorus ready to sing. Then you cut the current. The protons, free now, began to wobble back to their resting alignment. Not randomly, but together, spinning down in a slow coordinated spiral called Larmor precession. The rate of that spin was set by the strength of the surrounding magnetic field. Measure the frequency and the Earth told you its field strength at that exact location. 4.258 hertz per microteslas, give or take. It was, at its heart, a listening device. You wound it up and let it ring, and the planet rang back. Elliot sat on the floor without thinking much about where he was putting it. Then he noticed. He'd placed it directly over the calcite vein. He could see the faint, pale seam running beneath the concrete like an old scar. The magnetometer had no power. Battery compartment empty. Cable connector corroded green. A completely dead machine. It hummed. Low and clean and sustained, like a note bowed slowly on a cello. He crouched down and put his ear near the casing. The sound came from inside the fluid cylinder, a resonance with no business existing in a powerless device, like a tuning fork struck by something invisible. He put his hand on it. The hum from the machine and the hum in his chest found each other. They locked together the way two signals lock when you phase align them on a mixing board. That specific, almost physical snap of coherence when two waveforms stop fighting and become one thing. He looked at his watch out of habit. The second hand had stopped. The lights went out. There was a road, unpaved, dried dirt, rutted from wheels, hot August air carrying the smell of horses and motor oil and something sweet going off in the heat. No electrical hum beneath the soundscape. No traffic. No aircraft. The entire frequency landscape of the world was different. Shifted down into something older and slower. And Elliot registered it before he registered anything visual, because because that was simply how his brain was wired. Then he saw the car. Coming around a bend at maybe 15 miles an hour, swaying on leaf springs, black and tall and unmistakable, a Ford Model T. The driver wore a canvas duster and a flat cap and did not look at Elliot, which was possibly the only reasonable response to seeing a man in dark jeans and a gray thermal standing in the road in 1915. Elliot pressed his tongue to his teeth, felt his own face with both hands. He was here, fully, physically here, all sensory inputs arriving simultaneously in a way that dreams never quite managed. He listened. Beneath the receding engine, beneath the wind, beneath his own heartbeat, faint like a station you've drifted almost too far from. The hum was still there. 17.4 hertz. Attenuated by whatever distance he traveled, but holding. A carrier signal. A rope back. And then, underneath even that, lasting barely a second before the world snapped back. 3 notes. A simple descending figure, the intervals strange and hard to place, like a melody half remembered from a dream you'd already mostly forgotten. It felt less like hearing and more like recognizing. Then the concrete was under his knees, and the fluorescents were buzzing, and the magnetometer sat silent in front of him. He stayed on the floor for a while. An audio engineer's first instinct after something strange is to reconstruct the signal chain. His second instinct was to go upstairs and make coffee and pretend it hadn't happened. He went upstairs and made coffee. He sat at his desk and looked at his small cactus Werner. He had no opinions. He opened his laptop and after a long pause, typed field notes at the top of a new document and then sat there looking at it. He did not go back for 8 days. In those 8 days, he went to the literature. Not the physics literature exactly. He understood waves. He understood resonance. He read about infrasound, about Vic Tandy's research in the 1990s in a supposedly haunted laboratory in Coventry, England, where a faulty extractor fan vibrated at 18.98 hertz, close to the resonant frequency of the human eyeball, and produced feelings of dread and peripheral vision disturbances in everyone who worked there. The ghost was a bad fan. The haunting was a frequency. He read about magnetite. Every human being carries small crystals of it distributed through sinus tissue in the cerebellum. Iron oxide, the same material in compass needles, an inheritance from ancestors who needed to feel north before there were maps. Most researchers considered it vestigial. Others thought it was still doing something too subtle to measure cleanly. He read about a lab in Frankfurt that had demonstrated quantum coherence in bird navigation. How a robin could literally see magnetic field lines overlaid on its vision because of quantum effects happening in proteins in its eye. The bird's visual system read the Earth's field like a compass display. Quantum mechanics in a warm, wet living eye at body temperature, which physicists had called impossible for decades before the Frankfurt group showed it wasn't. Elliot read all of this at his kitchen table at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and told himself he was just reading. On the 8th day, he went back with a small field recorder clipped to his shirt pocket. He set the magnometer over the calcite seam and put his hand on the sensor casing and waited. The hum rose in his chest like a sustained organ note, that specific quality where you stop being able to tell if the sound is outside you or inside you. The recorder's level meters went flat. Not silent, flat. 0 across every frequency simultaneously, which was not a thing that happened. Silence still had a noise floor. This was something below noise. This was the sound of a medium with nothing moving through it. Then the lights went out and the smell arrived. Rot and cold smoke and something underneath both that he would spend a long time trying to describe and eventually settle on as mass biological. The smell of a city that had lost the infrastructure of the living. He was in a narrow cobblestone street, buildings leaning overhead, the sky a pale strip of flat white winter light. A red cross painted on a door across the way, still wet, paint running. He knew what it meant without having to think about it. Quarantine marker. Plague house. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that had moved through Europe in the mid-1300s and killed somewhere between a third and half of everyone, city by city, in about 4 years. One of the fastest demographic collapses in recorded human history. An event so total it measurably changed the genetic makeup of European populations for centuries after. Somewhere nearby, a handbell was ringing, slow and irregular. He pressed himself against the wall and breathed through his mouth and found the hum in his chest the way you find a pitch in a noisy room, by going quiet inside and listening past everything else. It was there, fainter than before, but there. And just before he locked onto it, just before he pulled himself back, 3 notes. The same 3. The same descending figure, the same strange intervals. Now with the bell ringing underneath them, as though the bell were part of the same composition. He came back. Knees on concrete, recorder still running. He rewound it and pressed play. Normal basement ambient sound, then the low building tone, then 11 seconds of absolute 0 on the meters. And at the very end of the gap, barely above the noise floor, 3 notes. Recorded, on the waveform, real. He ran a frequency analysis. The 3 notes were built on harmonics of 17.4 hertz. The same number. Tuned to this place, or this place tuned to them. He couldn't yet tell which way the causality ran, and was beginning to suspect it didn't run in one direction at all. He labeled the clip 3 notes and closed the laptop. Yeah, he said to Werner, I know. He was not going to touch that magnetometer again. He knew with the certainty of someone who has heard the first 3 notes of a song that's about to get completely stuck in their head that he absolutely was. Chapter 2. Deeper than the signal. The ship doesn't move through space. Space moves through the ship. Dr. Miguel Alcubierre on the Mathematics of the Warp Drive Metric, 1994. He had a theory. It wasn't a good theory yet. It was more like the outline of a shape in fog. Something he could walk around and squint at, but not quite touch. But it was there. The piezoelectric field from the limestone was generating a standing electromagnetic wave at 17.4 hertz. His body, specifically the magnetite in his sinus and cerebellar tissue, had been sitting inside that wave for 2 years of Tuesday afternoons, slowly synchronizing with it the way a clock on a wall will eventually sync to a stronger clock nearby. When the magnetometer brought the 2 fields into direct contact, machine and body, geological frequency and biological frequency, something happened to the fabric of his own personal position in space-time. He wrote this down, looked at it. It sounded like the notes of someone who had lost their mind, written in the careful handwriting of somebody trying very hard to appear as though they hadn't. The part he couldn't explain, the part that sat in the center of the theory like a room he couldn't find the door to, the 3 notes. They weren't a side effect. He was increasingly sure of that. They were present in both locations, across what he estimated was a gap of roughly 600 years, built on the same harmonic series, as though they were a property of the phenomenon itself rather than a feature of any particular destination, as though the mechanism had a sound, as though time, bent back on itself, rang. He went back on a Thursday this time, which felt like a small act of control. He brought the field recorder. He brought the brass compass that had been his father's, a surveyor who trusted analog instruments the way other men trusted scripture. He brought a notebook, and he brought, with some internal debate, a set of in-ear headphones plugged into the recorder. Because if the 3 notes were going to appear, he wanted to hear them with more clarity than his unaided ears had managed so far. He placed the magnetometer over the calcite seam. He sat cross-legged on the floor in front of it, headphones in, recorder running, notebook open on his knee. He put one hand on the sensor casing and held the compass in the other, and watched the needle begin its slow rotation. 360 degrees over about 40 seconds, smooth and deliberate, like something conducting an orchestra nobody else could see. He thought, I want to go forward this time. He had no idea if intention mattered. He had no reason to think it did. But he was an acoustics researcher, and he knew that in wave systems, the source mattered. The direction of the input shaped the direction of the output. So he held the thought, forward, further out, somewhere past the present, and pressed his palm flat against the sensor. The lights went out. This time, there was no smell, no air at all. He was horizontal. That was the first thing that registered. Not where he was, but how. The specific weightless quality of lying completely still in zero gravity, where your body loses its argument with the floor and simply floats a millimeter above whatever surface it's resting on. He was in a tube, roughly body-shaped, lit from within the walls by something blue-white and even, like the light inside a cloud. He was cold in the way that went past physical, a systemic cold, a slowed down cold, as though his core temperature had been sitting several degrees below normal for a long time, and his body had simply accepted it. A sound reached him gradually. Not gradually like it was getting louder, gradually like his auditory system was coming back online, one frequency band at a time, the way a recording fades in from silence. First, the very low end, a deep, rhythmic pressure that he felt more in the chest than heard. Then the mid-range, a kind of breathing, mechanical, slow, the ventilation system of something enormous. Then the high end, a faint digital tone, cycling, monitoring. He was in hypersleep. Or, he corrected himself, trying to stay clinical. He was occupying the body of someone who was in hypersleep. He could feel the difference between his own mind, alert and cataloging, and the body around it, which was deeply pharmacologically under, like being awake in a house where everyone else was asleep. He was a passenger. Through the transparent curved wall of the pod, he could see other pods, rows of them, blue lit, extending further than he could easily count. And beyond the pods, through a long horizontal window in the hull of whatever ship this was, space. Not the space of a photograph, real space. The specific deep black that has no bottom, salted with more stars than the atmosphere ever let you see from the ground. And among the stars, directly ahead, a structure in the geometry of space-time that his eyes told him was a visual distortion. A place where the stars bent around a central point like light bending around a drain, where space curved visibly, a throat of compressed geometry that he understood intellectually as a traversable wormhole and understood physically as the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The ship was heading into it. No, the ship was not moving. Elliot knew enough physics to know that an Albuquerque-type drive, the only theoretical framework that made this kind of travel plausible, didn't move the ship at all. It contracted space-time in front and expanded it behind, so that the space between here and there simply got shorter. The ship sat still inside a bubble of locally flat space-time, while the universe rearranged itself around it. You didn't travel faster than light. You just redefined what the distance was. The wormhole was getting larger in the window, or the distance was getting shorter. The deep rhythmic pulse Elliot had registered first was increasing in frequency. He recognized it now. The structural resonance of the ship's frame under the stress of the metric distortion. Every material has a resonant frequency, the rate at which it will vibrate most efficiently when energized. At the wrong amplitude, resonance destroyed things. Bridges, wine glasses, the fillings in your back teeth. At the right amplitude, it was just music. The ship was singing to itself as it fell through the fold in space. A low structural chord that shifted in pitch as the geometry outside the hull changed. And underneath the ship's chord, underneath the ventilation and the monitor tones and the deep pressure of the drive, 3 notes. The same 3. Unmistakable now, because he'd heard them twice before, and because they didn't fit the acoustic signature of the ship the way everything else did. They were native to something else entirely. They were not a property of this moment. They were a property of the mechanism. The wormhole filled the window. The stars around its edge bent further, the light stretching into arcs. Space-time doing something to photons that photons did not enjoy. Then the basement. Then his knees on concrete. Then Werner the cactus, 15 feet above him through a floor. Indifferent. Elliot sat in the dark for a moment before the lights came back. They always came back a few seconds after he did, which suggested the outage was a local effect tied to his presence rather than a building problem, which was its own category of alarming. And in that dark, he did something he hadn't done during the other 2 slips. He hummed the 3 notes back, quietly, to himself, into the basement air. The hum in the limestone answered, not with 3 notes, with a sustained chord, low and complex and resonant, more felt than heard, like the room itself recognizing what he'd played. He sat there a long time with that. He spent the next week building a rough timeline. Not of the slips. Those were by apparent design scattered and non-sequential, but of the 3 notes. When they appeared, how long they lasted, and whether they varied. They didn't vary, though. 3 notes, always the same 3, always the same intervals. A descending minor third, and then a drop to a note that sat between the 2. Not a note that existed cleanly in Western equal temperament, not quite in tune with the piano keyboard, but a note that existed in just intonation, in the older tuning systems that preceded the standardization of A equals 440 hertz. A frequency of roughly 194 hertz, if he had to commit to a number, which put it close to a G in old European model tuning, though not exactly. Close enough to recognize, different enough to feel ancient. 3 notes, a minor third, then a resolution that wasn't quite a resolution, like the end of a question stated as a fact. They appeared in 1915 Pennsylvania. They appeared in mid-1300s Central Europe. They appeared in a hypersleep pod aboard a ship entering a wormhole at an unspecified point in what he felt, based on the technology, like several hundred years in the future. 3 completely different eras. 3 completely different acoustic environments. 1 melodic figure, consistent down to the scent, showing up like a watermark pressed into each moment. Not following him, he was increasingly sure of that. They were already there. He was the one arriving. Chapter 3. Festival of All Frequencies. Sound is the vocabulary of nature. Pierre Schaeffer, In Search of a Concrete Music, 1952. He tried to go forward again. He didn't know if it was actually working, the intention thing, or if the slips were simply random and he was pattern matching into chaos the way humans did. Pattern recognition was the brain's primary function and its most consistent flaw. People saw faces in clouds, they heard meaning in static. He was an acoustics researcher. He knew better than most how easy it was for a trained ear to find signal and noise that wasn't there. But both times he'd gone into the past, he hadn't consciously aimed anywhere. The one time he'd held a direction in mind, forward, he'd ended up in the future. That was a sample size of 1, and a sample size of 1 was not science. It was a coincidence with ambitions. He tried anyway. He put his hand on the magnetometer, held the compass, aimed the thought. Forward, further, more. The lights went out. The sound hit him before anything else. Bass. Deep, structural, below hearing bass. The kind that reorganized your organs. A subfrequency so large it had a physical shape, arriving in waves you felt as pressure changes in the chest and eardrums. Above it, layered in strata, kick drum and synthesizer and processed vocal. Enormous, every element mixed with precision that took Elliot's professional mind about half a second to recognize as excellent. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had built this soundscape. The low end was tight and controlled, not muddying the mids, the stereo field wide without collapsing to mono in the center. He was standing in a crowd, a massive crowd, shoulder to shoulder, bodies in every direction, lit from above and below and from within by light sources that were both familiar and unfamiliar. LEDs certainly, but in configurations and colors that suggested engineering he didn't recognize. Narrow beam pin lights that moved with a fluidity too precise for anything he'd seen, and among the lights, floating autonomous spheres, palm-sized, drifting above the crowd, pulsing in rhythm with the music like bioluminescent jellyfish had decided to attend a concert. The stage was enormous. A curved surface of LED panels, some transparent, some reflective, forming an architecture that shifted shape between songs. Not a backdrop, but a structure, dynamic, responsive, rippling with visual frequencies that corresponded to the audio in ways a spectrum analyzer would have confirmed. He was watching a system, he realized. A cohesive sound and light and physical system, all speaking the same language. The air smelled like ozone and warm bodies and something he couldn't place. a faint sweetness that might have been whatever had replaced alcohol or might have been something entirely new. He looked at the crowd. People of all kinds, dressed in ways that were legible to him. Fabric, color, the basic grammar of human clothing, but cut and illuminated in ways he couldn't have bought anywhere he knew. Some wore garments that shifted color in real time. A few had bioluminescent patterns on their skin, subtle, like circuitry under the surface. None of it performed, all of it comfortable. A crowd that had grown up with these things and wore them the way any generation wore its moment. Nobody noticed him, which made sense. He was wearing dark jeans and a gray thermal and was probably the most boring looking person in a 50-meter radius. The track shifted. The DJ, visible on the stage behind a curved console, a small figure relative to the enormity of everything else, began a transition, layering a new element into the low end. Something with a rhythmic figure Elliot didn't recognize. Not quite a time signature he knew. 5/3 maybe? Polyrhythmic? The two patterns moving through each other like waves through each other, which was the thing waves did, and a thing most human music carefully avoided because it was too hard to dance to. The crowd danced to it, all of it, without apparent effort. Elliot stood in the middle of them and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was being given something. Not a clue, not data. Something larger than those things. A sense of what was worth preserving. What was worth the terrifying physics of getting here. The specific joy of a crowd of people gathered around organized sound in the dark. The fact that this, whatever year this was still happening. It still mattered. Still filled with whatever space it occupied, with people who wanted to be in the same place at the same time and feel the same frequencies. He had been an acoustics researcher for 11 years, and he had never particularly thought about why people gathered around sound. He had thought about how. He had never thought about why. The track built, the bass resolved, the lights converged. And at the peak, at the exact moment of the drop, when every element of the mix landed simultaneously and the crowd moved as one body in response, underneath of it all, beneath the sub-bass and the synth and the processed vocal and the sound system and the autonomous floating lights, 3 notes. Descending, strange intervals, 194 hertz at the bottom, resolving to nothing. Here too. Elliot stood in a crowd in a future he couldn't date and felt the 3 notes pass through him like a current. Not frightening this time. Something closer to recognition. Like hearing your name in a language you didn't know you spoke. He found the carrier signal on his chest. Followed it home. He sat on the basement floor and listened to the recording. The 3 notes were there, at the tail of the silence, same as before. He isolated them, layered them over the previous recordings. 3 notes from 1915, 3 notes from the 1340s, 3 notes from a ship crossing between stars, 3 notes from a festival in a future he couldn't name. The waveforms aligned perfectly, not approximately, perfectly, down to the millisecond of each attack, the curve of each decay. Not similar, identical. He stared at the overlaid waveforms on his laptop screen for a long time. Then he did something he hadn't done since college, since the years before acoustic research had replaced it with professionalism. He picked up the acoustic guitar leaning against the wall behind his desk upstairs, brought it back down to the basement, and played the 3 notes. He played them once. The room answered. Not metaphorically, The limestone beneath the floor, the calcite vein, the standing electromagnetic wave that had been running for 11,000 years, it resonated audibly. A sustained chord that rose from the concrete and the walls and the air itself, the room becoming the instrument the way rooms always were. The exact harmonic response he would have predicted if someone had asked him to calculate the resonant modes of a limestone substrate excited at 194 hertz. He played the same 3 notes again. Same response. The room knew the song. He sat in the resonance until it faded, and then sat in the silence that came after, which was a different kind of silence than the silence before. Fuller. Used. Then he went upstairs and made coffee and sat at his desk and looked at Werner for a long time. "The notes aren't following me," he said to the cactus. "I keep thinking they're following me." Werner offered nothing. "They're already everywhere," Elliot said. "I'm the one showing up." Chapter 4. The City That Was Dying. The past is never where you think you left it. Catherine Ann Porter. He knew he was going to go back to the Plague City. He'd known since the second slip. On some level he hadn't let himself look at directly. There was something unfinished there. Not in a dramatic sense. He hadn't left anything behind, hadn't made contact with anyone, had done nothing but press against the wall and breathe through his mouth and listen to a bell. But the slip had been the shortest of the 4, as though something had pulled him back before he was ready. As though the place wasn't done with him, or he wasn't done with it. He tried to aim backward this time. The thought, held deliberately as he pressed his palm to the sensor. Back. Earlier. The street. The lights went out. He was in the same street. He knew it immediately. The lean of the buildings, the specific angle of the lane, the way the cobblestones ran in a pattern that curved slightly left toward a wider road he could see at the far end. The Red Cross was still in the door, dried now, no longer running. Days later, maybe, than his previous visit, or earlier, he couldn't be sure which direction he'd arrived from. The smell was the same. He'd prepared for it this time. Breathed slow and even, and let his system adjust. It was colder now. His breath was visible. Late autumn or winter, the sky above the lane, the deep gray of a sky with no more weather behind it. No bell this time. Somewhere distant, voices. The sound of something being dragged on cobblestones. He moved. That was new. In the previous slips, he'd been frozen. Processing, overwhelmed, managing the basic facts of the situation. But he'd been here before. In this street, in this sensory environment, and some part of him had filed it under known, which freed up capacity for curiosity. He stepped out of the doorway he'd materialized in and walked toward the wider road at the end of the lane. The wider road was a market street, or had been. The stalls were mostly empty, and the ones that weren't were selling things in a hurry. Transactions happening with the speed of people who had recently recalculated what things were worth. A man sold bread from a cart, eyeing everyone who came near him with an expression that was calculating and afraid in equal measure. A woman moved quickly along the far side of the road with a cloth held over the lower half of her face. Elliot understood viscerally what it was to be inside a pandemic before vaccines, before germ theory, before anyone understood what was happening or why. The randomness of who died would have been the worst part, not the numbers, which were reported in historical texts in ways the mind processed as statistics, but the specific arbitrariness of it, the neighbor who died and the neighbor who didn't, the family where 3 of 5 survived and the family across the street where none did. Yersinia pestis was transmitted primarily by flea bite. Through respiratory transmission of the pneumonic form was also well documented. In 1349, none of that was known. It came and it took who it took, and you prayed and burned herbs, and some of you lived. He found a doorway set back from the road and stood in it and simply listened. The acoustic signature of the city was grief. That was the only way he could describe it accurately. Not the sound of grief, but the sound of a space shaped by it. The way a room is shaped by what happens in it over time. The specific quality of sound in a place where large numbers of people had stopped making noise. Gaps in the ambient sound where there should have been children. A missing frequency in the human range, like a section of a choir simply absent. He stood there a long time. He wasn't sure why. He had no way to help anyone and knew that attempting interaction risked things he wasn't prepared to risk. But leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. The same feeling as fast-forwarding through something important. Skimming the surface of something that deserved more than that. He owed it to the place to hear it. That was as close as he could get. A child appeared at the corner, 7 or 8 years old, a boy, wearing a wool coat that was too large for him and wooden-soled shoes that clacked on the cobblestones. He walked with the careful, deliberate step of a child who had been told to be careful and was taking it seriously. He didn't look sick. He looked directly at Elliot. Not through him, not past him, at him. With the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend not to stare. His expression was curious, cautious. He said something in a language Elliot couldn't identify. German, possibly, or a dialect so old it had shed the markers he might have recognized. Elliot said quietly, "I can't understand you. I'm sorry." The boy looked at him for another long moment. Then he did something that Elliot would think about for a very long time afterwards. He hummed 3 notes. Not confidently, not as a performance. Quietly, to himself, the way children hum when they're thinking. Descending, the same strange intervals. The same 3 notes that lived at the bottom of every slip, at the edge of every silence. Elliot went very still. The boy looked at him with an expression that might have been recognition, or might have been coincidence, or might have been something in between that he didn't have a word for. Then a woman's voice called from somewhere nearby. Urgent. And the boy turned and walked quickly around the corner and was gone. Elliot found the carrier signal in his chest and came back so fast it felt like falling. He didn't sit down. He paced the basement for a while, which he'd never done before post-slip. The post-slip standard was kneel, breathe, record. He paced and thought. The boy could have been humming anything. Children hum things they'd heard. A folk melody, a hymn, 3 notes from a song someone sang while working that he'd absorbed without knowing he was absorbing it. The fact that the intervals matched was he needed to be careful here. Needed to apply the discipline he'd built over 11 years of telling graduate students that data only meant what the methodology allowed it to mean. The fact that the intervals matched was significant. Possibly. with appropriate caveats. Or the three notes were old enough that this child had grown up hearing them. A melody that predated everything Elliot had visited. A melody that was maybe as old as the limestone, as old as the frequency. He sat down finally and opened his laptop and looked at the waveforms. 1915, 1349, Deep Space Hypersleep, the Futuristic Festival. He added a fifth marker. The boy. The boy humming three notes in a plague street and a dying city. 5 points in time, one melodic figure. No variation. He looked at it a long time. "Okay," he said to Werner. Werner waited. "Okay," he said again differently. The way you say a word twice when the second time means something the first one didn't. Chapter 5. The map you were already on. To find out what happens when you change something, it is necessary to change it. George Box, statistician. He spent 3 days building the table. Not a metaphorical table, a literal one. A spreadsheet, columns for each slip, rows for every variable he could document. Date of destination, estimated. Location, estimated. Duration, subjective. Acoustic signature, presence of the three notes, yes, always yes. Intensity of the three notes, rated on a scale he invented and immediately doubted. His physical state on return. The direction of the compass needle during the pre-slip precession. Whether he had aimed, and if so, in what direction. He was looking for a pattern that wasn't just frequency. Frequency he had. He needed geometry. The slips weren't random. He was increasingly sure. Or they weren't purely random. The destinations felt scattered. They were scattered, there was no linear chronology to them, but scatter wasn't the same as chaos. Scatter had a distribution. He was a researcher. He knew how to look at a distribution. He plotted the destinations on a rough timeline. Not by when he'd visited them, but by when they occurred in history. The Plague Street, approximately 1349. The Model T Road, approximately 1915. The festival, unknown future, estimated 200 plus years forward. The hypersleep ship, further forward, estimated 400 plus years. He was guessing on the future ones, but the guesses felt calibrated. The gaps weren't equal, but they weren't random either. They were increasing. Each jump from his present was larger than the last, as though the slips were exploring outward in both directions simultaneously, oscillating through time with an amplitude that grew with each cycle. A waveform. He was moving through time the way a wave moved through a medium, oscillating, the swings getting wider, the frequency staying consistent. A specific kind of wave behavior called dispersion, where different frequency components of a wave traveled at different speeds through a medium, causing the wave to spread and separate over time. The limestone was the medium. He was the wave. He sat back. Let that settle. If the pattern held, and he was aware of all the ways it might not hold, aware that he was reasoning from 5 data points, which was not enough data points, then the next slip would be further out than the ship, either further into the future or further into the past. possibly both. Possibly the dispersion was splitting, the waves spreading in both directions at once. He didn't know whether he could control it. He still wasn't sure the intention thing was working, or whether he was just telling himself a story about causality. But he tried to go forward and gone forward. He tried to go back and arrived on the same street. Small sample size, ambiguous data, enough to try again. He called his mother back. He'd been ignoring the text for 3 weeks, and she had escalated the phone calls in the patient way she escalated things, which was to simply keep calling at slightly increasing intervals until contact was made. He answered on the 4th ring and talked to her for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of what was happening, which was the most normal 40 minutes he'd had in a month. Afterward, he sat in his apartment with the lights on and thought about what he was doing. He had accessed apparently a closed time-like curve, a path through space-time that bent back on itself, using a decommissioned magnetometer, an 11,000-year-old piezoelectric field, and whatever the accumulated 2 years of Tuesday afternoons had done to the magnetite in his skull. He had visited 4 different periods of human history, one of which was not yet history. He had recorded, on a consumer field recorder, a 3-note melodic figure that appeared at the boundary of each displacement event, built on harmonics of the local geological frequency, and which a child in a medieval plague city had hummed to him in a street as though it were a thing everyone knew. He had not told anyone. He understood why. There was no version of telling anyone that didn't result in some combination of disbelief, concern, institutionalization, or the immediate involvement of people with institutional authority over what happened next. He was not ready for any of those things. He was barely ready for the thing himself. But sitting alone in his lit apartment, Werner on the desk behind him, the field recorder on the table with its 5 documented clips labeled in his careful handwriting, he felt the particular weight of a secret that had outgrown the space he'd made for it. It pressed on the inside of his ribs. It changed the quality of every room he sat in. He opened the recorder, played the 3 notes. In his apartment, far from the limestone, there was no resonant response. The notes played and stopped, and the room absorbed them the way any room absorbs sound. Imperfectly, with a little reverb from plaster walls, a slight tail. But in the frequency analysis on his laptop, visible if you knew what to look for, at the very bottom of the audible range, 17.4 hertz. Faint, steady, still here, still present, not dependent on the basement. He was carrying it. He went back to the basement the next morning. He sat on the floor with the magnetometer in front of him, hand on the sensor, compass in the other hand, recorder running. He didn't think about forward or backward this time. He thought about the 3 notes. Held them in his mind the way you hold a pitch before you sing it. Not as an abstract concept, but as a physical memory. The precise feeling of them in the chest. He thought, show me where you come from. The compass needle began its rotation. The hum rose. The lights went out. And the world unmade itself more slowly this time, more deliberately, as though whatever process had been lurching and stumbling through 4 trial runs had found its footing. The basement didn't vanish. It translated. The stone walls thinning to transparency and then to absence. The floor softening. The fluorescent armatures overhead becoming something else, something older. The entire architecture of the present moment folding back like a page to reveal the thing written underneath. The 3 notes played. Not faint this time. Not at the edge of hearing. Clear, present. A sound with a source. Elliot Marsh followed them into a darkness that was not empty. That was not the darkness of an absent room, but the specific darkness of a very great depth. The darkness of something that had been waiting, patient and low and tuned, for someone with the right ear to finally listen. He did not come back for a long time. Part 2. Amplitude. Chapter 6. What the darkness held. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. Soren Kierkegaard. He came back on a Friday. He knew it was Friday because when he climbed the stairs from the basement and walked out of the Stoller building into the afternoon, the campus was doing what it did on Fridays. Half emptied, the particular loosening of a week releasing its tension, students moving differently than they moved on Tuesdays. He'd been gone since Tuesday morning. 3 days. Subjectively, it had felt like considerably more than that, though he was having difficulty being precise about how much more, which was itself a new and interesting problem. He went home, showered, stood in the kitchen in a towel eating crackers from the box, because there was nothing else, and he hadn't thought about groceries since before any of this had become his life. Then he sat at the kitchen table with the field recorder and tried to document what had happened in the same careful, clinical language he'd used for the previous slips. He couldn't do it. Not because it was too strange. The previous slips had been strange and he'd documented them fine. He couldn't do it because what had happened in the darkness at the end of Chapter 5 wasn't a location. It wasn't a when or a where. It was something that didn't have a row in his spreadsheet, because his spreadsheet assumed destinations, assumed that the mechanism sent him somewhere, and what had happened this time was that it had sent him somewhere that was before somewhere. Before place, before time, the substrate underneath both. He sat with the crackers and tried to find words for it the way you tried to describe a color to someone who'd never seen it. There had been sound. That was the clearest part, the part he could actually report. In the darkness that was not empty, there had been sound, and the sound was the 3 notes. And the 3 notes were not faint or distant or at the edge of perception. They were enormous. They were the size of whatever space he'd been in, which was either very small or had no edges. He genuinely couldn't tell. The notes had a source. He'd felt the direction of it the way you felt the direction of sound in a dark room. The binaural processing of his auditory cortex doing its job even when his eyes had nothing to offer. The source was not close. It was not far. It was in a direction he didn't have a word for because the word would have had to be a direction that wasn't north or south or up or down, but something orthogonal to all of those. A direction that only existed inside the mechanism. He wrote in his notebook, "I heard where they come from. I don't know how to get there yet." He looked at that sentence for a while. Then he added, "But I think I'm supposed to." He wasn't sure where that last part came from. It didn't feel like a thought he generated. It felt like something he'd already known and was only now writing down. The semester continued around him like weather. He taught his 2 undergraduate sections, one on room acoustics, one on signal processing. And he held office hours, and he reviewed 2 papers for a journal, and he answered emails with the conscientious delay of a man who was technically present but personally elsewhere. Nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, they attributed it to the general distraction of a researcher deep in something, which was a condition his department recognized and largely respected. He spent his evenings with the recorder and the laptop running analysis he had already run, looking for something new in the data. There was nothing new in the data. The data was exactly what it had always been. 5 clips. 5 sets of 3 notes. Perfect alignment across every dimension he could measure. He kept coming back to the harmonic series. The 3 notes were built on 17.4 Hertz and its harmonics. The overtone series, the natural mathematical sequence that every vibrating object produced. The reason a plucked guitar string sounded like a guitar string and not a sine wave. The fundamental and its integer multiples, 17.4, 34.8, 52.2, 69.6, on up through the audible range, each overtone quieter than the last, the whole series adding up to the characteristic timbre of the sound. The 3 notes of the melody sat at specific points in that series. The 11th harmonic, the 13th, and the 9th. Not the simple low harmonics that Western music had built itself around. The octave, the 5th, the 4th. The higher, stranger, more dissonant partials that most musical traditions had quietly agreed to ignore because they didn't fit neatly into any scale system. He looked up the 11th and 13th harmonics. They appeared in a harmonic series of instruments that played in just intonation. The tuning system based on pure mathematical ratios rather than the equal temperament that divided the octave into 12 equal semitones for the convenience of keyboards. They appeared in the natural horn, the instrument before valves, which could only play notes that the harmonic series provided and which produced, as a result, a scale that sounded slightly wild and unresolved to modern ears. And they appeared, he found, after several hours of research that took him further into music theory than he'd been since his undergraduate elective, in one other place: the solfeggio frequencies. A set of tones described in medieval sacred music, attributed to some historical sources to a Benedictine monk named Guido d'Arezzo, who had developed a system of musical notation in the 11th century, and in other less academically rigorous sources attributed to various ancient and mystical origins that Eliot would normally have dismissed immediately. He did not immediately dismiss them this time. Not because he'd lost his scientific discipline, because the frequency values assigned to the solfeggio tones included in the 3rd position of the 6-tone scale, 528 Hertz. Exactly the 24th harmonic of 17.4 Hertz, rounded to the nearest integer. A relationship too precise to be coincidence, and too strange to be anything he had a clean framework for. He wrote it down, put a question mark after it, stared at the question mark. Then he went to the basement. Chapter 7: Ice and Iron. Climate is what you expect. Weather is what you get. Robert A. Heinlein. He aimed for the furthest back he could hold in his mind. Not a specific date. He didn't have the precision for specific dates and was no longer sure precision was how the mechanism worked anyway. He held a feeling. Ancient. Stone tools, an open sky, and a cold that predated language. The lights went out. Cold was the first word, and it was not adequate. The kind of cold that reorganized priorities instantly, that moved survival to the front of the line and pushed everything else back. He was standing on a plain that extended in every direction to a flat horizon. The ground a mixture of frozen soil and gravel and patchy yellow-gray grass bent flat by wind. The sky was enormous and low and the color of old pewter, and moving across it from the northwest was a bank of cloud that had the particular gray-green tint of serious incoming weather. He was in the Pleistocene. He couldn't have said exactly how he knew that. The landscape alone could have been any number of cold periods, any number of northern latitudes. But the smell of the air carried something his 21st century lungs had never processed. An absolute chemical cleanliness, the absence of industrial particulate, of agricultural nitrogen, of combustion byproducts, of the invisible chronic contamination that had become so baseline in modern air that the body had stopped registering it as contamination. This air was what air was before humans burned anything larger than a campfire. It tasted like the inside of a stone. The wind was in the range of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour from the northwest, sustained with gusts that staggered him. He wrapped his arms around himself and understood immediately that the gray thermal he perpetually wore was not designed for this, and that he had a limited time budget before the cold became a psychological problem than a sensory one. Hypothermia proceeded in stages. The shivering began when core temperature dropped below 35 degrees Celsius. Thinking became impaired below 32. Cardiac arrhythmia was possible below 30. He was already shivering. He needed to find the hum fast and stay oriented. He closed his eyes and listened. The wind was extraordinary acoustically, not loud, enormous. The difference between a loud sound and an enormous one was a matter of frequency content. A loud sound had energy concentrated in a narrow range. An enormous sound had energy across the entire spectrum simultaneously, wrapping around the listener, arriving from every direction, filling the entire audible field without gap. The wind on this plain was enormous, ancient. The sound of an atmosphere doing what atmospheres did before there was anyone to name it. Underneath it, 17.4 hertz. Stronger here than anywhere he'd been, which made sense. No buildings, no infrastructure, no electromagnetic interference from human technology. Just a limestone signal traveling up through the earth, attenuated by distance from Stoller, but unmistakable to a body that had spent 2 years learning it. And then the 3 notes, barely there at the wind's edge, so faint he had to stop breathing to catch them. Same 3, same intervals, here too, in the Pleistocene era, in a wind that predated agriculture, predated pottery, predated the controlled use of fire by a margin that was difficult to even hold in the mind. The notes were older than he'd let himself consider. He'd placed them in medieval Europe in 1915 in the future. He had not let himself think about how far in the other direction they might go. A sound reached him from his left, low and rhythmic and biological. He turned. 300 meters away, moving along the edge of a shallow gully where the ground dipped and offered some protection from the wind, was a group of large animals. Woolly mammoths. 4 adults and what appeared to be 2 juveniles, moving with the patient, deliberate economy of animals that had evolved for exactly this environment. Their outer coats were the reddish-brown of dried clay, long guard hairs streaming in the wind underlaid with the dense wool that gave them their name and their thermal architecture. They moved in a loose group, the largest adult at the front, and they were making sound. A low, infrasonic rumbling that Elliot felt in his chest before his ears caught it. the elephant family communication that occurred below human hearing, used for long-distance contact, for family coordination, for distress calls that could carry several kilometers through ground and air simultaneously. He had studied infrasound professionally for over a decade. He had measured it in buildings and concert halls and geological formations. He had never stood in the open air and felt it coming from a live creature. He stood in the cold and listened to mammoths talk to each other in frequencies below the range of human hearing, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the geological signal and everything to do with the specific, irreplaceable fact of being alive and in the presence of other living things, even things that had been extinct for 12,000 years, even things that did not know he was there. The wind gusted. He staggered. His fingers had gone from cold to the specific non-feeling that preceded real danger. He found the hum, followed it back. He came back gasping, the warmth of the basement hitting him like a wall, his hands shaking badly, his lips numb. He sat on the floor with his back against the shelving unit and waited for his body to remember what temperature it lived in. When he could hold a pen, he wrote in his notebook, in handwriting that was shakier than usual, "The notes are not medieval. They are not human. They are as old as the frequency itself. Whatever made them before we existed to hear them." He underlined that last sentence, then sat looking at it. The question he'd been circling for weeks without wanting to land on it directly was now unavoidable. If the three notes predated humanity, who had composed them? The answer that kept presenting itself was the one he kept setting aside because it didn't fit any framework he'd been trained inside of. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a civilization. The three notes weren't composed. They were generated. The way the limestone generated its frequency, the way the bell generated its tone when struck, the way any resonant system produced sound when energized. The mechanism itself was singing. Whatever the closed time-like curve was, whatever the physical structure of it looked like in space-time, whatever the geometry of the thing he was sliding through when the lights went out, it had a resonant frequency. Of course it did. Everything had a resonant frequency. The geometry of the curve, the specific curvature of space-time in that location, the standing wave structure of 11,000 years of piezoelectric field. All of it together formed a resonant cavity, and resonant cavities rang. They rang at frequencies determined by their shape and their medium. The three notes were the sound of the mechanism, which meant they weren't a clue pointing towards something else. They were the thing itself, ringing. The lock announcing its own existence. A bell that rang every time the door opened, whether anyone was there to hear it or not. He sat with that for a long time. It explained everything he had observed. It explained nothing about where the darkness at the end of chapter 5 had been taking him, or what it had wanted to show him, or whether wanted was even a word that applied to a geological electromagnetic phenomenon. He wasn't sure it didn't apply. He'd been in enough resonant spaces, concert halls, cathedrals, the inside of an anechoic chamber that absorbed 99.99% of sound and produced a silence so total that you began hearing your own nervous system, to know that spaces did things to the people inside them that went beyond physics. That the relationship between a resonant system and the thing resonating inside it was not entirely passive. That rooms shaped sound and sound shaped rooms and both of them shaped the people who moved through them. The mechanism had been shaping him for 2 years before he even knew it was there. He was increasingly unsure who was doing the listening and who was doing the playing. Chapter 8. She already knew. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. Albert Einstein. Would I believe? 1930. Her name was Dara Osai, and she was a third-year PhD student in the geophysics department, which shared a building with acoustics 2 days a week when the scheduling algorithm decided to be generous. Elliot had seen her in the hallway. He knew her the way you knew people in adjacent departments, by face and feel, not by conversation. She knocked on his office door on a Wednesday morning and said, without preamble, "You've been spending a lot of time in the Stoller basement." He looked at her over the top of his laptop. Storage access, secondary rig. "Your secondary rig has been disassembled for 18 months, she said. "I know, because I almost tripped over it in the hallway when the facilities moved it." He said nothing. She came in without being invited and sat in the chair across from his desk with the ease of someone who was not particularly concerned about the social protocol of uninvited sitting. She was maybe 26, natural hair pulled back, wearing a field jacket with a geological survey patch on the shoulder that looked genuinely worn in rather than decorative. She set a folder on his desk. "I've been mapping the piezoelectric field under Stoller," she said, "for my dissertation. Crustal stress analysis, microseismic monitoring. Very boring. Nobody cares, which is how I like it." She tapped the folder. 6 months of magnometer readings from the basement. "And there's an anomaly I can't explain." Elliot looked at the folder without touching it. "The field spikes," she said. 4 times in the last 3 months. Significant spikes. Order of magnitude jumps in the local electromagnetic signature. Each one lasting between 90 seconds and 11 minutes. No seismic event to explain them. No electrical fault in the building. No solar activity. Nothing. She paused. "They correspond to dates when the building access logs show your keycard in the basement." The room was very quiet. "That's a coincidence," Elliot said, which was such an inadequate thing to say that he regretted it immediately. "Probably," she said, with the tone of someone who did not think probably meant what he wanted it to mean. "Can I ask what you're working on down there?" He looked at her for a long moment. At the worn patch on her jacket, at the folder full of 6 months of careful magnometer readings that had caught his displacement events the way a seismograph caught tremors, indirectly, from the outside, measuring the shape of a thing she hadn't seen directly. He thought about the 3 notes. About a child in a plague street humming them without knowing why. About mammoths talking in infrasound on a Pleistocene plain. About the darkness that had held something enormous and directional and patient. He thought about the weight of the secret that had outgrown its container. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "This is going to sound," he said, "like I've lost my mind." "I'm a geophysicist," she said. "We spend a lot of time with data that sounds like someone's lost their mind. Go ahead." He told her. All of it. The spectrogram, the magnetometer, the phase lock, the slips. The Model T road and the plague street and the hypersleep pod and the festival with the floating lights. Pleistocene plain and the mammoths in the cold. The 3 notes and their harmonics, and the solfeggio connection, and the darkness that was not empty, and the sense of a source in a direction he couldn't name. He told her about the boy in the plague street who hummed 3 notes to a stranger and then walked away. She listened without interrupting. Her expression did not do the thing he'd feared. Did not glaze, or tighten into skepticism or concern. It did the thing a scientist's expression did when the data arrived that was genuinely unexpected. Got very still and very focused. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she opened the folder and turned it around so he could see the graph on the first page. 6 months of magnetometer readings from the stellar basement. 4 spikes, exactly as she described. And overlaid on the spikes in red ink, she'd added by hand a frequency annotation. 17.4 hertz. I know what the anomaly is, she said. I didn't know what was causing it. I still don't, technically. She looked at him with an expression that was precise and serious and not at all frightened. But I've been hearing something in the basement for 3 weeks. When I'm running my readings late at night, a low tone, and sometimes underneath it, she paused, 3 notes. Elliot sat back in his chair. Outside his office window, the campus moved through its Wednesday. A leaf blower, delivery truck, the ordinary percussion of a world that had not been informed of any of this. Werner, he said. She looked at the cactus. Is that relevant? No, he said. I've been telling him about this for months and he's been very unhelpful. He looked at her. You're the first actual person I've told. Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read. Not quite surprise. Something closer to the expression of a person who's been walking alone for a long time and has just heard footsteps that match their own pace. Okay, she said. So, what do we do next? What they did next was go to the basement together. She brought her own equipment, a triaxial fluxgate magnetometer, more sensitive than the proton precession unit by roughly 2 orders of magnitude, capable of measuring field variations in the range of picoteslas rather than nanoteslas. A proper scientific instrument, current, powered, calibrated last month. She set it up beside the old decommissioned unit with the care of someone arranging a very important conversation. Elliot set his hand on a proton precession sensor and looked at her. You won't see anything, he said. From the outside, the spikes on your readings are probably it. The lights go out, I go somewhere, I come back. From your perspective, it'll just be me sitting on the floor and then the lights. I know, she said. She had her laptop open, the fluxgate readings scrolling in real time. I'm not here to see it happen. I'm here to measure what happens to the field when you do. She looked up from the screen. The field is the part I can work with. The rest of it, I'm going to have to trust you on from now. He nodded. He pressed his palm to the sensor. The hum found the chest. He thought about the direction he couldn't name, the source in the darkness. He thought, closer. Take me closer to the sound. The lights went out. He was in a tower. Stone walls, narrow, circular. A spiral staircase carved directly into the rock winding upward to his left. Torchlight from a bracket on the wall, the flame bending toward him in a draft from somewhere below. The air was cold and carried the smell of old stone and tallow and something medicinal. herbs maybe. Something hung to dry from the rafters of whatever was above him. Medieval by the construction and the light. Earlier than the plague street, the stonework here was rougher, older, dry-fitted without mortar in the lower courses. Somewhere in the range of the 11th or 12th century, he guessed, though he was aware his architectural dating was approximate at best. He was in a scriptorium, or adjacent to one. Through a low arched doorway he could see a long wooden table lit by multiple candles, and at the table, bent over a manuscript with the concentrated posture of a person doing fine work in inadequate light, stood a monk. Robes, tonsure, the medieval monastic uniform. He was writing, or not writing exactly. He appeared to be drawing. Musical notation from the look of it. The early Nume system of marks above text that preceded the staff. The visual language Guido Arezzo had been systematizing in this approximate century. He was notating music. Elliot stood very still in the doorway. The monk didn't look up. He was completely absorbed, moving his pen with the careful, deliberate speed of someone transcribing something he was hearing rather than copying from another source. His lips were moving slightly. He was singing to himself, barely audible under his breath. Elliot listened. 3 notes. Not hummed the way the child had hummed them, not played the way Elliot had played them on a guitar. Sung, with the specific open throat of sacred choral tradition, the vowels long, the tone placed forward in the skull, resonant and clear and perfectly tuned to the intervals he had measured and analyzed and carried with him across 6 different points in time. The monk was writing down the 3 notes. Elliot took 1 step into the scriptorium. The monk stopped singing, went very still in a way that suggested he was aware on some level that something had changed in the room. He did not turn around. He sat with his pen above the parchment and breathed, and Elliot could see his shoulders with the slow rise and fall of someone deciding something. Then the monk set the pen down and turned. He was older than Elliot had expected. 60s maybe, face creased by decades of stone-cold rooms and inadequate diet. Eyes pale and extremely alert. He looked at Elliot with the expression of a man who is not entirely surprised. As though he'd been waiting, not specifically, not with a name in mind, but with the patient understanding that something of his kind was eventually gonna arrive. He said something in Latin. Elliot spoke no Latin, but the tone was clear. Not alarm, not confrontation. Something closer to acknowledgement. A greeting between 2 people who didn't share a language, but shared something more load-bearing than language. Elliot pointed at the manuscript, at the notation the monk had been writing. The monk looked at the page, then back at Elliot, then did something that crossed every language gap there was. He picked up the pen and slowly, deliberately, played the 3 notes again in the air with it, the gesture miming a conductor, the 3 intervals traced in candlelight. Elliot hummed them back, all 3. The monk went very still again. Then slowly, he smiled. Not with surprise, with the expression of a man who had spent a long time working alone on something important and has just for the first time been understood. He turned back to the manuscript and wrote something below the neumes. Latin. Elliot couldn't read it. Then he turned the parchment and pushed it toward the edge of the table where Elliot could see it. He pointed at the text, then up, at the ceiling or the sky beyond it, or something beyond that. Then the torchlight bent again, and the stone walls thinned, and Elliot came back. The lights returned. Dara was on her feet, not alarmed, but alert, watching him. The flux gate was screaming numbers across her screen. 17 minutes, she said. Your longest one yet. The field distortion was... She looked at the screen and shook her head. I'm going to need to recheck the calibration because these numbers are not possible. Why do you say that? They say the local electromagnetic field experienced a torsion event. A twisting, basically. The field lines rotated around a vertical axis centered exactly on the calcite vein, at a rate that implies an energy source I cannot account for. She looked at him. The energy budget is wrong by about 4 orders of magnitude. Whatever generated this was not the piezoelectric field alone. No, Elliot agreed. Where did you go? He told her about the tower, the monk, the manuscript, the 3 notes written in human notation above a line of Latin he couldn't read. She was quiet for a moment. What century? 11th or 12th? Rough estimate based on the stonework and the notation style. She opened a browser on her laptop and typed for a moment. Guido d'Arezzo died around 1050. He's the monk who developed the Solfeggio system, the U, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La notation. She looked it up. The frequencies assigned to those syllables, the Solfeggio frequencies, were based on a Gregorian hymn, U, Que, Laxis. Each phrase of the hymn started 1 note higher than the last, so he used it to teach sight singing. She turned the laptop so he could see. The frequencies associated with the 3rd syllable of the scale, Mi, is 528 hertz. The 24th harmonic of 17.4, Elliot said. Yes. She held his gaze. What if the Solfeggio frequencies weren't invented? What if someone heard them from the same source you've been hearing the 3 notes from, and wrote them down? The basement was very quiet. The monk was transcribing something, Elliot said slowly. Not composing. His lips were moving like he was talking dictation. Dictation from what? Elliot thought about the darkness that was not empty. The source in the direction without a name. The thing that had been waiting with the patience of something that did not experience time the way anything else did. I don't know yet, he said, but I think we need to go back to the darkness. We? She said. Not a question. He looked at her. You've been hearing the notes for 3 weeks. The field has been interacting with your equipment for 6 months. You're already in it. She looked at the flux gate, at the impossible numbers on the screen, at the old decommissioned magnetometer on the floor that had no business being anything other than a museum piece. Okay, she said, the same word he'd used in his office when something moved from hypothesis to fact. Show me how. Chapter 9. 2 signals, 1 frequency. The universe is not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose. J.B.S. Haldane, Possible Worlds, 1927. Teaching someone else to do it was the hardest thing he'd done since it started. Not because the mechanics were complicated. They were, in a sense, brutally simple. Sit near the magnetometer, contact with the sensor, let the phase lock happen, don't fight the hum. The difficulty was that every part of that process was experiential rather than instructional. You couldn't talk someone into synchronizing their internal magnetite with a geological electromagnetic field. You couldn't give step-by-step directions for following a carrier signal home when everything around you was trying to distract you from it. It was, he realized, exactly like teaching someone to hear. Not the mechanics of hearing, the ear did that automatically, but the discipline of listening, of pulling a specific signal out of a complex acoustic environment, of holding attention on one frequency while the rest of the world competed for it. He had spent 11 years developing that skill professionally. He had spent 2 years developing it, apparently, in this specific application without knowing that was what he was doing. He started where he always started, with the spectrogram. He pulled up the 17.4 hertz reading on his laptop and pointed at it. That's the field. That's what you're trying to sync with. Your body already knows it. You've been sitting in it for 6 months of late night readings. You've been hearing the 3 notes. That means the magnetite in your embryonic tissue is already in proximity to phase lock. You're closer than you think. She looked at the spectrogram with the expression of someone reverse engineering a process that had been running unconsciously. The nights I hear the notes, I always feel slightly disoriented after, slightly off. I figured it was late nights and low blood sugar. It's partial entrainment, he said. The field is pulling your frequency toward its own. You've just never gone all the way into contact with the source. She slowly nodded. The magnetometer is the bridge. The magnetometer completes the circuit. Your biological field, the geological field, the sensor is the meeting point. When the 3 lock into coherence, the phase alignment creates a local distortion in the Kerr adjacent geometry of the space-time around the calcite vein. He paused, aware that he was sliding back toward language that lost people. Think of it like tuning. Your body is a receiver. The limestone is a transmitter. The magnetometer is the fine-tune knob. When everything lines up, you get signal. And the signal is a closed time-like curve. The signal is access to one, yes. I think the curve itself is a permanent feature of the geology here. It has been for a very long time. We're not creating it. We're just learning to hear it. She sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the magnetometer, facing it, and closed her eyes. He watched her breathe. Slow it down. He'd never watched himself do this from the outside, and the observation was strange. The minute adjustments of a person learning to be still in a very specific way, the way a musician learned to be still before playing, the pre-performance silence that wasn't absence, but preparation. She put her hand on the sensor. The compass needle began to turn. "Oh," she said quietly, eyes still closed, not surprised, more like arriving somewhere she'd been trying to get to. The hum rose, and Elliot heard it differently this time, from outside it, the way you heard a chord differently when you weren't the one playing it. It was a third higher than he'd registered before. Not 17.4 hertz, higher in the harmonic series, which made sense. Her biological resonant frequency wasn't identical to his, and the mechanism was accommodating her, tuning to her range the way a good instrument tuned the player. The lights went out. And this time, Elliot went with her, because his hand was on her shoulder and apparently physical contact within the field was enough, which was a data point he filed in the rapidly expanding folder of things he needed to think about later. They were in the darkness together. Not the featureless darkness of the first time. Richer now, more textured. The way a room felt richer once you knew its dimensions. He could feel her beside him. Not as a physical presence exactly, but as a second signal in the field. A second waveform running along his own. Distinct, but harmonically related the way two voices in a duet were distinct and related simultaneously. The three notes were there, enormous as before, but doubled now. The melody present in two registers simultaneously, his frequency and hers. The same three notes at different positions in the harmonic series, combining into something that was more than either one alone. A chord rather than a melody. A richer, more complete sound. The kind of thing that happened when two resonant systems found each other and the result was larger than the sum. And the source, the direction without a name, the thing he'd felt before and reached toward and not quite arrived at, was closer. Not because they'd moved, because two signals were stronger than one. Because whatever the mechanism was listening for, they were providing more of it together than he'd been able to provide alone. Like increasing the gain on a signal until a distant transmission resolved from static into something intelligible. He felt Dar's attention moving through the darkness the way you felt the sound engineer's ear working a mix. Methodical, sweeping, looking for the signal in the noise. She was better at this than him in certain ways. She'd spent 6 months with this field. She had an ear too, differently trained, calibrated to geological signal rather than acoustic. But the underlying skill was still the same. The discipline of listening past what was easy to hear towards what mattered. The source resolved. Not into a place, not into a when, into a sound. A full chord, vast. The entire harmonic series present simultaneously from the fundamental to the highest audible partial and beyond. A sound that existed at every frequency at once, the way white light existed at every color at once. The three notes were in it, as they were in everything, because the three notes were specific harmonics of this fundamental chord, the way individual colors were specific wavelengths of white light. The mechanism wasn't playing three notes. It was playing everything. The three notes were just the part of everything that human auditory systems could catch. The part of the full spectrum that fit inside the narrow window of what a biological ear could process. The source was the whole frequency. The whole frequency was the mechanism. The mechanism was the space-time geometry of this specific location, shaped by 450 million years of limestone and 11,000 years of standing wave, in the accumulated electromagnetic history of a planet that had been generating fields and frequencies and resonances since before any living thing had existed to notice. The Earth was playing, had been playing since before there were ears. They came back together, both of them on the floor, both of them breathing hard, the lights flickering back on in their characteristic delayed way. Dara sat up first, looked at her hands, then at him. "The source isn't a destination," she said. "No. It's not a when. It's not somewhere we can go to." "No," he said again. "It's what everything is made of. We've been trying to find the origin of the signal. The signal is the origin." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, distantly, A campus bell rang the hour. Ordinarily, iron, hung in a tower someone had built because humans built towers and put bells in them and rang them to organize time, which was what you did when time was something that moved in one direction and could be divided and measured and assigned. So what does that mean for where we go next? She said. Elliot thought about the monk in the scriptorium, about the Latin he couldn't read that the monk had written below the neumes and pushed toward him, about the gesture up, the pen pointing at the ceiling or the sky or something beyond. I need to go back to the tower, he said. I need to read what he wrote. You don't speak Latin. No, he said, but you might know someone who does. She looked at him. Then she reached into her field jacket pocket and pulled out her phone and opened her contacts and scrolled. My advisor, she said. He's a medievalist on sabbatical in Rome. He'll think I've lost my mind. Yeah, Elliot said. Tell me about it. Chapter 10. The Inscription. Music gives color to the air of the moment. Karl Lagerfeld. He went back to the tower alone. Dara had argued for coming with him, and he'd made the case, which he believed, that two people in a medieval scriptorium at whatever hour it was in the 11th century doubled the risk of something going wrong in a way they couldn't account for. She had accepted this with the pragmatic grace of a scientist who understood that controlled experiments limited variables and had extracted, in return, a promise that he would describe everything in more detail than he thought was necessary. He put his hand on the sensor, held the tower in his mind, the smell of tallow, the draft from below, the monk's pale, alert eyes. The lights went out. He was in the tower again. Same draft, same torchlight, same cold. The scriptorium was empty. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. The long table was there, the candles burning low, the tools of manuscript work arranged in the careful order of someone who valued their instruments. And at the near end of the table, held flat by a small stone on each corner, the manuscript. Open to the page the monk had been working on. The neume notation visible above a line of text, and below it, separated by a ruled line, the Latin the monk had written and pushed toward him. He leaned over it. His Latin was limited to the phrases that had leaked into scientific nomenclature in a semester of it 20 years ago that had left him with the ability to recognize words without necessarily knowing what they meant. He looked at the text slowly, parsing what he could. Vox, voice or sound. Ante, before. Omnia, everything or all things. Something he couldn't get. Then, et, and. Omnia, again. Then a word he knew from geology. Terra, earth. Then, respondent, which had the shape of respond, response, the Latin root he recognized from acoustic terminology. In room acoustics, the impulse response of a space, how a room answered a sound. He straightened, put it together the way you put together a mix, finding the through line in the separate elements. Vox ante omnia, sound before everything. Et omnia terra respondet, and all the earth responds. He stood in the candlelight scriptorium of an 11th century monastery and read the words a monk had written down because he'd been hearing the frequency of the earth in a basement for long enough that the earth had started to talk back, and felt something shift in the architecture of everything he thought he understood. Sound before everything, and all the earth responds. Not a mystical claim, a physical one. A statement of acoustic fact about the nature of the mechanism. That the frequency predated the listening. That the earth had been generating this signal since before anything existed to receive it. And that the correct response to a signal was not to analyze it from a distance, but to answer it. To resonate. To put your own frequency into the field and let the field respond. He had been listening. That was the first half. He had not yet answered. Not really, not fully. He thought about what Dara had said in the darkness. 2 signals were stronger than one. About the chord that was larger than either melody alone. About the monk who had sat in a cold tower in the 11th century, hearing a frequency that had been running for 10,000 years before him, and writing it down in the only notation system available to him, leaving it there on the page for whoever came next. He picked up the monk's pen. He was aware this was a significant decision. He had maintained across every slip a strict non-interaction posture. No contact, no interference, nothing that altered the past he was moving through. Every physicist who had ever theorized about closed, time-like curves had tripped over the grandfather paradox, the bootstrap paradox, the general problem of causal loops. If you went back and changed something, what happened to the timeline that had produced you? He did not know the answer to that. He did not know if the answer mattered here, where causality appeared to run in more than one direction simultaneously. He wrote 3 notes in Western staff notation below the monk's news. Not to correct him, to add a voice, to leave in the manuscript the evidence that someone else had heard it too. Someone from a time the monk couldn't have imagined, using a notation system that hadn't been invented yet, confirming across 1,000 years that the signal was real and had been received. And then he set the pen down and came back. Dara had the Fluxgate data waiting. 22 minutes this time. The field distortion more complex than any previous event, exhibiting a pattern she described as bimodal. 2 overlapping torsion signatures rather than one, even though only one person had entered the field. 2 signals, Elliot said. She looked at him. You took something with you. The inscription, what the monk wrote. I read it in Latin, roughly, and I wrote back. He told her what the Latin said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Vox ante omnia. That's not a description. That's an instruction. He waited. Sound before everything. Before the slip, before the destination, before the intention you hold going in. She was working it out as she spoke, the way she worked through field analysis, building from data toward interpolation. You've been using the hum as a carrier signal, as the thing you lock onto to navigate. But what if it's not the carrier? What if it's the instrument? What if you're not supposed to listen to it? You're supposed to play it. The basement was very quiet. Elliot thought about the guitar upstairs on his desk. about the night he'd played the 3 notes and the room had answered, about a resonant cavity that only sang when something sang to it first. "We need to introduce sound into the mechanism," he said slowly. "Not receive it, generate it, actively." "The monk had a voice," she said. "He sang them. You said his lips were moving. He was singing while he wrote." "He was singing them into the stone." Elliot looked at the old magnetometer. "At the calcite seam in the floor, at 11,000 years of compressed frequency waiting, patient and low, in a cold basement under a university that had been built on top of it without knowing." He was playing the instrument. And the instrument played back. And the instrument played back. They agreed. He stood up, looked at her. "I need to get the guitar," he said. She stood too. And then she did something he didn't expect. She hummed the 3 notes. Clear, full voice, the intervals exactly right, 194 hertz at the bottom, the resolution that wasn't quite a resolution. Her voice filled the basement the way voices filled the spaces they were built for, and the limestone responded. Not faintly this time, not subtly, but fully. The sustained chord rising from the floor and the walls and the air, the room singing back its own frequency, 2 sounds braiding together into something that was not quite either one, that belonged to the space between them. The compass needle, sitting on the floor beside the magnetometer, began to turn. "Go get the guitar," she said. Part 3. Resonance. Chapter 11. The Instrument. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Nikola Tesla. The guitar was a 1974 Martin D28, his father's, the same man who had owned the brass compass and believed in analog instruments. It had a Sitka spruce top, an East Indian rosewood back and sides, and a neck that had developed over 50 years of use, the specific worn smoothness of an object that had been held by hands long enough to carry the memory of them. Elliot had played it since he was 14 and had gotten competent without ever getting good, which suited him fine. He was not a musician. He was a person who understood acoustically why the guitar sounded the way it did and could play it well enough to hear that understanding in practice. He carried it down to the basement carefully, the way he carried old things. Dara was already there, the flux gate running, her laptop open, her coffee going cold on the shelf the way her coffee always went cold because she forgot it existed the moment something more interesting appeared. She looked at the guitar and then at him. "Martin D28, she said. "Good choice. Sitka spruce top, low damping coefficient, strong fundamental resonance, good sustain. You couldn't have picked a better acoustic instrument for exciting a standing wave in a limestone substrate." "I didn't pick it for those reasons," he said. "I know, but they're still true." He sat on the floor with the guitar across his knee, the way he always sat with it, and tuned it carefully against the 17.4 hertz reading on his laptop, adjusting the open strings to harmonics of the geological frequency, the way you tuned to a room before playing in it. The low E string, 82.4 hertz in standard tuning. He dropped to 69.6 hertz, the 4th harmonic of 17.4. The A string adjusted, the D, He was not playing in any standard tuning by the time he was done. He was playing in the tuning of this specific place, this specific stone, this specific standing wave that had been running since before the university existed, since before the town existed, since before anyone had built anything on top of it at all. He played the 3 notes. The room responded the way it always responded. The sustained chord rising from the floor, the walls joining in, the basement becoming briefly a concert hall for a frequency most concert halls were never designed to hold. But this time, there was more. More volume, more complexity, more of the upper harmonics present and audible because the guitar was driving the stone with more energy than his voice had provided. The spruce top vibrating at frequencies the limestone recognized and answered. He played them again, held the last note. The compass on the floor beside the magnetometer began its rotation. "Field is responding," Dara said quietly, watching her screen. "Torsion event building, more gradual than the instantaneous events before. It's like the field is being shaped rather than triggered, like tuning something." "That's exactly what it is," Elliot said, and played the 3 notes a third time, and this time he didn't stop, he let them loop. The same 3 descending into each other and beginning again, around, a cycle. The 3 notes consuming their own tail and starting over, and the room built beneath him like a wave that had found its period and amplitude and was no longer searching. Dara put her hand on the magnetometer sensor. He kept playing. She began to hum. Not the 3 notes, something else. Something that moved between them, filling the intervals with a sustained tone that the 3 notes had always implied and never stated. A 4th voice in the chord. The note, the mechanism, had been waiting for someone to find. The lights didn't go out this time. They changed. The basement was still the basement. The shelving was still there, the old equipment, the concrete floor, the pale seam of the calcite vein running its patient 11,000-year line from one end of the room to the other. All of it present, all of it real. But overlaid on it, visible through it the way you saw a watermark through paper held up to light, was something else. The same space at a different moment, or all its moments simultaneously. Every version of this room that had ever existed or would exist stacked transparently on top of each other. The way a long exposure photograph captured every position of a moving light as a single blurred arc. He could see stone walls through the drywall. He could see open field through the stone. He could see briefly a version of this space that had no ceiling because no building had been built yet. Just a limestone shelf open to a sky full of stars in configurations he didn't recognize because they were either very old or very new. The 3 notes were everywhere. Not loud. Present, the way air was present, the way the temperature of a room was present. They were the acoustic character of the space. They had always been the acoustic character of the space. Every person who had ever sat quietly in this location for long enough had heard them on some level and filed them under the vague category of stillness, of depth, of the particular quality of certain places that made you want to stay without knowing why. Elliot kept playing. He understood now, fully, what Dara had worked out from the monk's inscription. This was not a mechanism you operated. It was a mechanism you joined. The difference was everything. You didn't drive it toward a destination. You didn't navigate it like a vehicle. You became another resonant element in its structure. The way a string became part of a guitar's voice. The way a voice became part of a room's response. You added your frequency to the field, and the field incorporated you, and in the space created by that incorporation, you could move. Not because you'd aimed somewhere, but because the whole system was moving and you were now part of the whole system. The scattered timeline made sense from here. Of course it had been scattered. He'd been dropped into the moments where the frequency was strongest, where the limestone signal had a correspondence in the surface world, where something in a particular had been vibrating at a harmonic of 17.4 hertz and created a temporary resonant path. The Model T's engine note, the bell in the plague street, the structural resonance of the ship under metric distortion, the festival sub-bass reaching down through the soil, the mammoth's infrasound traveling through the ground. Every destination had been a place where the Earth's frequency and the surface world's frequency had briefly aligned, and he'd been delivered to the intersection. He had not been traveling randomly. He'd been traveling to every place the signal had been answered. He played the 3 notes and understood that he was one more answer in a very long list. The overlaid visions settled. The basement resolved back to itself, singular and present. The light returned to normal fluorescent, though something about it felt cleaner than before, as though the room had been aired out. Dara opened her eyes. Her hand was still on the magnetometer sensor. She looked at the flux gate data on her laptop with an expression that was not quite readable. Not awe exactly. More like the expression of someone who had just understood a very long equation and is still working out what the answer meant. The torsion event lasted 41 minutes, she said. Neither of us moved. The field built and held and released. She paused. The release signature is different from any of the previous events. Every other event terminated abruptly. This one tapered, like a note decaying. Because we let it finish, Elliot said. We didn't pull away. We played it through to the end. She nodded slowly, then looked at him. You understood something in there. Everything. He set the guitar carefully on the floor beside him. The whole structure of it, why the timeline was scattered, why the notes appeared in every era, why the darkness felt like it had a direction. I understood all of it. And he thought about how to say it in language that was adequate, which it wasn't going to be, and said it anyway. The mechanism isn't a time machine. It's a resonance map. It shows you every place and every when that has ever been in frequency with this location. Every moment in history where something was vibrating at a harmonic of 17.4 hertz, and the Earth heard it and responded. We weren't traveling. We were being shown the correspondence, the places where the signal had been received. She was quiet for a moment. The monk was singing the frequency into stone, and the stone was singing back. He'd found the same thing we found 600 years earlier with his voice instead of a magnetometer. He just didn't know the physics. He knew the practice. And the boy in the plague street had grown up near enough to the stone to have absorbed it, the way I absorbed it over 2 years of Tuesdays. Children do that faster. Their nervous systems are more plastic, more willing to train to environmental frequencies. He was humming the ground. She sat with that for a moment. Outside the basement, a door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the floor above, someone's day proceeding normally in the ordinary world. The mammoths, she said. Elliot almost smiled. Infrasound. They were generating frequencies in the range of 14 to 24 hertz, directly overlapping the signal. They'd been doing it for thousands of years before us, before the monk, before anyone. He looked at the calcite seam in the floor. The mechanism is older than humanity. We didn't discover it. We're just the latest things to hear it and answer. Chapter 12. Vox ante omnia. The job of the artist is always to deepen the mystery. Francis Bacon. There was one thing left to do, and they both knew it without saying it directly, for a day and a half. Moving around it the way you moved around a piece of furniture you hadn't decided where to put yet. The darkness. Not the scattered destinations, the slips in the road, and the plague street, and the ship, and the festival, and the Pleistocene plain, and the tower. Those were the map. The darkness was what the map was a map of. The substrate underneath the destinations. The pre-place he touched at the end of Chapter 5 and come back from shaken and unable to document because his spreadsheet had no row for it. Now he knew what it was. Now he knew how to enter it properly. Not by triggering the mechanism and being dropped into it, but by playing his way into it. By joining the frequency rather than being taken by it. The difference between falling into a river and swimming in one. He needed to go back, and he needed to go all the way. They prepared with the seriousness of people who understood what they were preparing for. Dara spent 2 days running field analysis, building a baseline measurement of the mechanism's normal behavior so that any deviation during the event would be quantifiable rather than just felt. She set up a secondary recording array, 4 additional magnetometers arranged around the perimeter of the room, and a configuration that would allow her to map the 3-dimensional shape of the field distortion rather than just its magnitude at a single point. She calibrated everything twice and wrote the calibration values in permanent marker on each instrument's casing. Elliot restrung the guitar with phosphor bronze strings that had a broader frequency response than the factory strings, better for producing the upper harmonics he now knew mattered. He practiced the 3 notes in the basement every morning for 2 days, not to get better at playing them, but to let the room get used to him playing them, to build the entrainment back up to the level it had reached before the 41-minute event, so that when the time came, the field would recognize his signal immediately rather than spending time locking in. On the 3rd morning, he came down to find Dara already there, her equipment running, her coffee already forgotten on the shelf. And sitting on the shelf beside the coffee, watching him with the flat, evaluative gaze of a creature that did not recognize the concept of an uninvited guest because the concept of invitation was, from its perspective, entirely backwards. A cat. An orange tabby, medium-sized, tail curled around its feet, one ear slightly torn from some past disagreement. It looked at Elliot with the specific expression of a cat that had decided a location belonged to it and was prepared to be patient about everyone else catching up to this fact. "Where did that come from?" Elliot said. "It was here when I arrived," Dara said without looking up from her screen. "I think it comes in through the gap in the foundation wall on the east side. I've seen it in the building twice before. Facilities knows about it, has been pretending not to." The cat looked at the magnetometer, then at Elliot, then back at the magnetometer, with the air of something that had already taken the measure of both and found them acceptable. "Cats have magnetite too," Elliot said, almost to himself. "In their ethmoid tissue. Same as birds, same as us. They navigate by the Earth's field." Dara looked up at that, looked at the cat. "You think it's been in training?" I think it's been coming to this room for a reason, and I think the reason is the same as ours. And I think it figured that out considerably faster than we did. He set the guitar case down. It's been here the whole time, we just didn't notice it. The cat, as though satisfied that this had been established, closed its eyes. Elliot opened the guitar case. He played the same 3 notes into the stone for 20 minutes before he invited the mechanism to respond, which was a patience he hadn't been capable of at the beginning of any of this and was capable of now. The room built around him. The field tightened. The compass turned its slow 360 and then kept turning, continuous now, a full rotation every 40 seconds as the torsion event deepened. Dara hummed her interval, the 4th voice, the implied note. Her eyes were closed. The cat, without opening its eyes, began to purr. The purr of a cat falls between 25 and 150 hertz, a frequency range that overlaps with documented therapeutic efforts on bone density and tissue repair. Researchers had proposed that cats evolved purring partly as a self-healing mechanism, the vibration maintaining skeletal and muscular health during long periods of rest. The specific purr of this specific cat in this specific room on this specific morning produced a fundamental frequency of 34.8 hertz, the second harmonic of 17.4, a perfect octave above the geological signal, clean and warm and continuous, a third element in the chord that Elliot and Dara and the limestone were building together. 3 voices, 3 notes, 1 frequency, expressed in 3 different registers by 3 different resonant systems. Geological, human, feline. They had all, by different paths and over different time scales, found their way to the same basement and the same stone and the same standing wave. The lights didn't change this time. The room didn't overlay. Elliot simply felt the mechanism open beneath him, the way a depth opened beneath the surface of still water when you looked at it from the right angle. And he followed the 3 notes down into it without breaking his playing, without stopping the loop, carrying the music with him the way you carried a light into a dark place. The darkness was not dark. That was the first thing he understood. Arriving in it with his eyes actually useful this time. The darkness was not an absence of light, but an absence of the particular kind of light that required a source. It was luminous in the way that a material was luminous when it was itself, generating what it emitted rather than reflecting something from outside. The space around him glowed with the frequency, with 17.4 hertz made visible, if visible was a word that applied, a blue-white, undifferentiated luminescence that came from everywhere and illuminated nothing in particular because there was nothing in particular to illuminate. Just the frequency, expressed as light, filling a space that had no walls because it was a space inside the wave rather than a space the wave moved through. He played the 3 notes. The response was immediate and total. Every surface of the non-space resonated. The entire harmonic series present simultaneously, the way it had been in the darkness before, but more so now, because he was generating the input rather than just receiving the output. He was inside the impulse response of the mechanism itself. He was the signal, and the room was answering. And the answer was everything. Every destination he'd visited in a single simultaneous presence, not stacked on top of each other, but woven, each when and where present as a harmonic of the same fundamental. The Model T road, a different overtone of the same note as the plague street, and the festival in the ship, and the Pleistocene plain in the Monk's Tower, and all the other moments that the frequency had touched across its 11,000 years of continuous operation. He understood that he was hearing the complete recording. Every moment the signal had been answered, preserved here in the resonant memory of the mechanism. The Earth had been listening, and the Earth remembered everything it had heard. He played the 3 notes a final time. Not to trigger anything, not to navigate anywhere. As an answer. His own frequency, offered fully, without reservation, into the field that had been patiently building him toward this moment for 2 years of Tuesday afternoons, and a sequence of trips through time that had seemed scattered and were not, that had seemed random and were a careful curriculum, that had taken him to every place and every when where the signal had been strong enough to reach, showing him the map of its own history, the record of every living thing that had ever been in frequency with the Earth and known it. He was not the first. He was not the last. He was the latest answer to a question the ground had been asking since before anything walked on it. The darkness held the note he played. Then, gently, as the room gently absorbed the sound until silence returned, it let him go. He came back with his hands still moving on the strings, the 3 notes playing into the basement air, the room around him carrying the resonance of the last hour like a hall carried the memory of an orchestra after the last chord had ended. Dara was on her feet, not alarmed, lit up, the expression of someone whose instruments had just given her the most interesting data of her career, and possibly her life. The cat was still on the shelf, still purring, eyes still closed, entirely unbothered. 68 minutes, she said. The field held the entire time. No collapse, no interruption, full torsion event from start to finish, with a decay curve that I am going to spend the next year analyzing. She looked at him. You didn't go anywhere. I went to the source. But you stayed here. Yes. He set the guitar down carefully against the shelving unit. That's the point. The source is here. It's always been here. Every trip was just the mechanism showing me that the signal reached everywhere before bringing me back to where it came from. She sat down cross-legged on the floor, which was the thing she did when she was about to think seriously. The geophysicist's version of settling in. So it's closed. The loop. You followed the frequency all the way to its source, and the source is the frequency itself. Yes. That's a tautology. Most true things are, he said, at the bottom. She was quiet for a moment. Then, are you done? Is the mechanism done with you? He thought about it honestly. About the way the darkness had felt when it released him. Not finished, but complete. The difference between a door closing and a conversation ending. One was an ending, the other was an arrival. I don't think it works that way, he said. I don't think there is a done. I think we found the instrument and learned how to play it, and now we can play it, and playing it is the thing. It's not a means to an end. It's the practice. She nodded slowly, looked at the calcite seam in the floor. I'm gonna need a much larger dissertation. You're gonna need a different dissertation entirely. Yeah, she almost smiled. Yeah, I know. The cat opened one eye, evaluated the situation, and closed it again. Chapter 13. The hum. Still there. The end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. T.S. Eliot, Little Gidding, 1942. Three weeks later, Eliot was eating a sandwich in the basement on a Tuesday. Not a deliberate callback. He hadn't planned it that way. It was Tuesday. He was in the basement. He was eating a sandwich. The rhythm of the thing had simply reasserted itself because rhythms did that. Because certain patterns weren't load-bearing, and once you'd lived inside them long enough, they held you even when you weren't paying attention. The laptop was open beside him, showing a spectrogram. 17.4 hertz at the bottom, steady and clean, present the way it had always been present. He looked at it with the specific quality of attention you gave something that had changed in your understanding without changing in itself. The frequency had not changed. He had changed, and the frequency looked different through changed eyes. Dara was in the geophysics department upstairs, rewriting her dissertation from the third chapter forward. She had told her advisor, not about the mechanism, not yet, possibly not ever in those terms, that she had made an unexpected discovery in the piezoelectric field data that reframed her entire research question. Her advisor had said that unexpected discoveries were the only kind worth making, and told her to take the time she needed. She had thanked him and gone back to a spreadsheet that was much larger than the one she'd started with. The monk's manuscript was in a library somewhere in Europe, had been for 9 centuries, catalogued as a fragment of early Gregorian notation with an unusual addendum. Staff notation in a style that postdated the rest of the document by roughly 1,000 years, added by an unknown hand, depicting 3 descending notes in an unidentified tuning system. Musicologists had noted it as a curiosity. Nobody had known what to make of the addendum. It had been photographed for a digital archive in 2019, and the photograph sat in a database that Eliot had found after 3 hours of searching. The 3 notes visible on his laptop screen in the same intervals he'd played into the stone. His own handwriting from 11 centuries ago, a message he'd left for himself before he knew he was leaving it. The bootstrap paradox. The note was in the manuscript because he'd written it there. He'd written it there because the monk had shown him the manuscript. The monk had been writing notes he heard from the frequency. The frequency had been running since before the monastery was built. The causality ran in a circle, and the circle had no beginning, and that was fine. That was, he had decided, simply what certain true things looked like from the inside. He took a bite of his sandwich, looked at the spectrogram. The cat was on the shelf. It was always on the shelf now. Facilities had officially given up pretending it wasn't a permanent resident of the Stoller basement, and had begun leaving a small dish of water near the east foundation wall, with the resigned generosity of an institution that had lost an argument it hadn't known it was having. The cat had not been named by anyone officially. Eliot called it Werner, and when he did, the original Werner, the cactus, 3 floors up on his desk, seemed to him suddenly to have always been a placeholder for this, for a living indifferent presence that asked nothing of him except to understand that it had been here longer and would be here after. Werner, the cat, opened its eyes and looked at the magnetometer. It sat on the floor over the calcite seam, silent and powerless, a decommissioned machine from 1987 that had stopped being a piece of junk the moment it found its correct position in the field. Werner looked at Eliot. Eliot looked at Werner. "Not today," he said. The cat held its gaze for a moment with the expression of a creature that understood the concept of "not today" and was prepared to extend credit on the basis of eventual reliability. Then it closed its eyes. Eliot finished his sandwich, closed the laptop, and sat in the hum that was always there. that had been there before the building, and before the town, and before language, and before anything that walked on two legs and looked up at the sky and wondered what the lights were. The hum that had been asking its question since before there were ears to hear it. The hum that now knew, with the accumulated certainty of 11,000 years of standing wave, that the ears had finally found it, that they had listened, that they had played, that the answer, like all answers to questions this old and this deep, was not a destination. It was a frequency, and the frequency was still going.